What if the person you spent your entire childhood competing against was actually the one you were meant to find? What if every rivalry, every challenge, every moment you thought you were fighting to prove yourself better than them? What if all of it was just your heart's clumsy way of saying, see me, know me, don't forget me? We tell ourselves that love is supposed to arrive like lightning, sudden and unmistakable, burning away all doubt in a single brilliant flash. But what if the truest kind of love is the opposite? What if it's the one that grows so slowly you mistake it for something else entirely? The one that lives right next door to you for years before you're finally brave enough to open the door and let it in. There's a peculiar cruelty in proximity. The closer someone is, the easier it becomes to take them for granted, to assume they'll always be there, to convince yourself that what you feel is annoyance or competition or anything other than the terrifying vulnerability of caring deeply about someone who sees all of you. The brilliant parts and the broken parts, and everything in between. We run from the people who know us best, because being truly known is more frightening than being alone. We build lives in distant cities and call it ambition, when sometimes it's just elaborate avoidance, a way of escaping the uncomfortable truth that home has always been a person, not a place, and that person has been waiting right next door all along. This is a story about Seok Ryu, who spent 10 years running from a neighborhood that felt too small, and a rival who made her feel too much, only to discover that sometimes falling apart is the only way to find your way back to what matters. It's about Seung-hyo, who stayed in the place everyone else wanted to leave, who built his dreams in the shadow of hers, who loved patiently and quietly while she was busy proving herself to a world that would never love her back the way he did. And it's about the 20 steps between their front doors, a distance so small it should have been meaningless, but somehow contained all the years, and all the words, and all the feelings they'd been too scared to name. Because here's what no one tells you about love. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself with fireworks and certainty. Sometimes it whispers in the familiar, in the person who's been there so long you forgot to notice them, in the realization that the life you were chasing was never as real as the one you left behind. Sometimes love is coming home broken and finding someone who doesn't try to fix you, but simply sits beside you in the wreckage and says, I'm here. I've always been here, and I'm not going anywhere. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't leaving or achieving or proving yourself to the world. Sometimes it's just having the strength to stay, to face what you've been running from, and to finally let yourself be loved by someone who's been loving you all along. So if you've ever wondered whether you made the right choice in leaving, if you've ever felt the pull of home and didn't know whether it was nostalgia or something deeper, if you've ever realized too late that the person you took for granted was actually the one who mattered most, this story is for you. This is Love That Lives Next Door. This is about the return that changes everything, the rival who was never really a rival at all, and the 20 steps that contain an entire lifetime of almost love finally becoming real. There are places we leave behind believing we've closed the door forever. We pack our bags, we say our goodbyes, we promise ourselves that forward is the only direction that matters. But somehow, life has a way of bending that straight line into a curve, a gentle, insistent arc that brings us back to where we started. Seok Ryu learned this the hard way. After years of building a life far from the neighborhood where she grew up, she found herself standing once again on the same street corner where she used to wait for the school bus, her suitcase heavy not with clothes, but with all the weight of what she left unfinished. The air smelled the same, jasmine and fresh bread from the bakery that never changed its recipe. Even the cracks in the sidewalk were exactly where she remembered them, like old scars that refused to fade. Coming home wasn't part of her plan. In the city where she'd made her career, she had crafted a version of herself that felt polished, controlled, successful. But beneath that surface, something had been breaking for months, quietly, invisibly, like ice cracking under pressure you can't see. When everything finally collapsed, when the perfect life she'd built revealed itself as nothing more than a beautiful facade, there was only one place her heart knew to return to. Not because it was easier, not because it was safer, but because sometimes, when we lose our way completely, we need to go back to where we first learned to walk. The neighborhood welcomed her back with the same indifferent kindness it always had. The trees a little taller, the houses a little more worn, but the essence unchanged, like a song you haven't heard in years that your body still knows how to dance to. Her mother opened the door before Seok-ryu could even knock, as if she'd been waiting by the window all these years. They didn't speak much that first evening. Words felt too small for what needed to be said. Instead, they sat together in the kitchen while her mother made tea the old way, and Seok-ryu watched the steam rise and disappear, thinking about how some things leave without ever really going away. That night, lying in her childhood bedroom with the same pale yellow walls and the window that faced the house next door, she realized that returning wasn't about moving backward. It was about finally having the courage to face what she'd been running from. And what scared her most wasn't the thought of rebuilding her life from scratch. It was the realization that the ghosts she'd been trying to escape had addresses, names, and worst of all, they lived right next door. The next morning arrived with the kind of cruel brightness that makes hiding impossible. Seok-ryu had planned to stay inside for at least a week, maybe longer. Long enough to rehearse what she'd say if she ran into anyone who knew the girl she used to be. But her mother had other plans, sending her to the corner store for groceries with the gentle insistence that only mothers possess, the kind that sounds like a suggestion but feels like destiny. She pulled her cap low over her eyes and walked quickly, hoping that speed and anonymity could shield her from recognition. For 3 blocks, it worked. She was almost at the store, almost safe, when she heard it. A voice she hadn't heard in years but would recognize anywhere, in any crowd, in any lifetime. Seok-ryu? Her body froze before her mind could catch up. There's a specific kind of panic that comes from being seen when you're not ready to be visible, and it rushed through her like cold water. She turned slowly, and there he was. Seung-hyo, standing in front of his family's house with a coffee cup in one hand and an expression of such genuine surprise that she couldn't tell if he was pleased or horrified to see her. He looked different, taller somehow, though that shouldn't be possible anymore. His boyish features sharpened into something more certain, more grounded. But his eyes were the same, dark and observant, and entirely too good at seeing through whatever mask she tried to wear. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the narrow street, and Seok-ryu felt every embarrassing memory from their childhood rise up like a tide she couldn't hold back. "You're back," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. It was an observation delivered in that same even tone he'd always used, the one that made it impossible to tell what he was actually thinking. She wanted to say something clever, something casual that would make it seem like this moment didn't matter, like seeing him again was as ordinary as seeing any old neighbor. But the words stuck in her throat like stones. All she could manage was a small nod, her hands gripping the shopping list her mother had written until the paper crumpled in her fist. Seung-hyo took a step closer, crossing that invisible line that separated his territory from hers, just like he used to do when they were kids. Always pushing boundaries, always showing up exactly where she least wanted him to be. "How long has it been? 8 years? 9? His voice was softer now, almost careful, as if he understood that this moment was fragile and could shatter with the wrong word. 10, she heard herself say, and immediately regretted it. Admitting she'd counted the years felt like admitting something deeper, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. An awkward silence settled between them, filled with all the things they'd never said and probably never would. Finally, Seung-hyo smiled, not the cocky grin from their childhood battles, but something gentler, almost sad. "Welcome home, Seok-ryu." And then he walked back into his house, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk with a racing heart and the uncomfortable realization that coming home meant more than just returning to a place. It meant returning to the person she used to be, and to the boy who had somehow always been able to make her feel like that awkward, competitive, defenseless version of herself that she thought she'd outgrown. As she continued to the store, her legs felt unsteady, and she understood with perfect clarity that avoiding Seung-hyo for the next few months, or years, was going to be impossible when his door was literally 20 steps from hers. That night, Seok-ryu couldn't sleep. She lay in her old bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the plaster like ghosts dancing to music only they could hear. Seeing Seung-hyo had opened a door she'd spent years trying to keep locked, and now memories were flooding through like water through a broken dam. She remembered being 7 years old, standing in her front yard with a spelling test clutched in her small fist, crying because she'd gotten second place. Second place to him. Always him. Seung-hyo with his effortless brilliance, his quiet confidence, his way of making everything look easy while she struggled and fought for every single achievement. Back then, she'd convinced herself that she hated him. Hated his perfect posture, his neat handwriting, the way teachers smiled when they said his name. But hate was such a simple word for something so complicated. Because mixed in with all that rivalry and resentment were other moments, softer ones that she'd tried to forget, like the time she fell off her bike and scraped her knee so badly she couldn't walk, and Seung-hyo had appeared out of nowhere with bandages he'd stolen from his mother's medicine cabinet. He hadn't said anything comforting, hadn't made a fuss, just cleaned the wound with steady hands while she bit her lip to keep from crying, and then helped her home without once mentioning that she'd been trying to beat his cycling record when she crashed. Or the summer when her dog died, and she'd spent 3 days refusing to come outside, and she'd found a folded note slipped under her door with a drawing of her dog, and the words, "He was a good dog," written in Seung-hyo's careful handwriting. She'd kept that note in a shoebox for years, though she never told anyone, especially not him. Their relationship had always existed in that strange space between enemies and something else, something neither of them had the vocabulary to name. They competed over everything: grades, sports, who could climb higher in the old oak tree at the park, who got to the bus stop first, whose science project was better, whose parents were prouder. The neighborhood used to joke about it, calling them fire and ice, sun and moon, destiny's rivals. But underneath all that competition was a kind of intimacy that came from truly seeing each other, from being witnessed in all their striving and failing, and trying again. Seung-hyo knew her in ways no one else did. Knew that she studied until midnight every night, because good grades didn't come naturally to her like they did to him. Knew that her confidence was a carefully constructed armor she wore to hide how desperately she feared not being enough. And she knew him too. Knew that beneath his calm exterior was a boy carrying the weight of enormous expectations. Knew that his perfection wasn't effortless at all, but the result of relentless pressure he'd never learned to name. When she left for university in the city 10 years ago, she'd felt nothing but relief. Finally, she could be herself without constantly being measured against him, without that invisible thread that seemed to tie their lives together whether they wanted it or not. She'd promised herself she wouldn't look back, wouldn't let the past define her future. And for a while, it had worked. She'd built a new life, made new friends, became someone who existed independent of that small neighborhood and the boy next door. But now, lying in the darkness of her childhood room, she realized something that made her chest ache with a feeling she couldn't quite name. All those years, all that distance, and she'd never truly let go. Seung-hyo had remained there, in some quiet corner of her heart, like a bookmark holding a place in a story she'd never finished reading. And now that she was back, now that she'd seen him again after all this time, she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Some people leave marks so deep that time can't erase them, and some connections refuse to be severed no matter how far you run. The days that followed turned into an elaborate dance of near misses and careful timing. Seok-ryu became an expert at listening for the sound of Seung-hyo's front door, at peeking through her bedroom curtains to make sure his car was gone before she stepped outside. She learned his schedule without meaning to. He left for work at 7:30 every morning, returned around 6 in the evening, sometimes went for a run at sunset. She timed her life around his absence like a thief planning a heist, except what she was stealing was simply the peace of not having to face him, not having to feel that uncomfortable flutter in her chest that showed up uninvited every time she remembered his voice saying her name. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, this turning of her own neighborhood into an obstacle course designed to avoid one person. But avoidance, she was learning, only works until it doesn't. On a Tuesday afternoon, she was bringing groceries in from her mother's car when she heard his voice behind her, casual and unbothered, as if he hadn't noticed her week-long disappearing act. "Need help with those?" She nearly dropped the bag she was holding, oranges threatening to spill onto the driveway like her carefully constructed defenses. "I'm fine," she said too quickly, not turning around, keeping her eyes fixed on the front door that suddenly seemed miles away. But Sung-hyo was already there beside her, taking the heaviest bag from the trunk with an ease that made her feel foolish for struggling. "You don't have to," she started, but he was already walking toward her house, and she had no choice but to follow, her heart beating faster than the situation warranted, her mind racing with all the words she didn't want to say. He set the bag down on her front porch with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, then turned to face her with an expression that was harder to read than she would have liked. "You've been avoiding me," he said. And it wasn't an accusation, just a fact stated plainly, the way he might comment on the weather or the time of day. Seok-ryu felt her face grow warm, caught between the impulse to deny it and the realization that lying would be pointless. "I haven't been," she tried, but the words died under the weight of his knowing look. They stood there in the afternoon light, two people who'd known each other their entire lives, suddenly strangers who shared too much history, and the silence between them felt like a living thing, pressing against her chest until she had to say something, anything, to make it stop. "It's just been a lot coming back. I needed time to adjust." It was a half-truth at best, and they both knew it. Sung-hyo nodded slowly, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed in that way that made her want to scream, because how could he be so calm when she felt like she was standing on shifting ground? "I get it," he said finally. "Coming home isn't easy, especially when home remembers versions of you that you've tried to forget." And there it was, that uncomfortable talent he'd always had for saying exactly the thing she was thinking, but didn't want acknowledged. She looked away, focusing on a crack in the porch step, on anything but his face and the understanding she saw there. "I should go inside," she said, reaching for the grocery bag. But he didn't move, didn't step back to give her space. Instead, he did something worse. He smiled, small and sad and entirely too knowing. "We're going to have to talk eventually, Seok-ryu. We live next door to each other. Unless you're planning to become nocturnal or move to another country, avoidance isn't really a long-term strategy." He was right, of course. He was always right, and that had been one of the most infuriating things about him back when they were kids. The realization settled over her like a weight. She couldn't hide forever, couldn't restructure her entire life around the fear of running into him, couldn't let the past hold her hostage in her own neighborhood. But knowing something intellectually and being ready to face it emotionally were two entirely different things. And right now, standing on her front porch with Sung-hyo looking at her like he could see every defense she was trying to build, she felt about as ready as a person standing at the edge of a cliff being told to jump. "Maybe," she said quietly, and it was the most honest thing she'd said to him since coming back. "Maybe we will talk. Just not today." She expected him to push, to use that logical mind of his to dismantle her excuses, but instead he just nodded, taking a step back, giving her the space she so desperately needed. "Not today," he agreed, and then he was walking back to his house, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the uncomfortable truth that you can't outrun what lives right next door. 3 weeks passed in this strange limbo of polite nods and careful distance. They'd achieved a kind of peace, fragile and surface level, the kind that works only because neither person dares to dig deeper. Seok-ryu had almost convinced herself that this was enough, that they could coexist as cordial neighbors who shared a complicated past, but no real present. She'd started to breathe a little easier, to walk outside without her heart jumping at every sound, to believe that maybe time had smoothed over the sharp edges of whatever unfinished business lay between them. But life has a way of shattering illusions exactly when you've grown comfortable with them. And hers shattered on a Thursday evening when her mother invited the entire neighborhood over for dinner, without warning her that entire neighborhood included the family next door. She was setting the table when she heard his voice in the living room, warm and familiar as he greeted her parents like he'd done 1,000 times before. Her hand stilled on the silverware, her breath catching in a way that annoyed her because she was supposed to be past this, supposed to be the adult who could handle a simple dinner party without her composure crumbling. But when Seung-hyo walked into the dining room and their eyes met across her mother's carefully arranged table, something shifted in the air. A charge, a recognition, a silent acknowledgement that they couldn't keep pretending forever. He was dressed simply, a dark sweater that made him look older somehow, more settled into himself, and she realized with an uncomfortable jolt that he wasn't the boy she remembered anymore, hadn't been for a long time. He was a man now, with a life and a career and probably relationships she knew nothing about, and that distance between who he was and who she remembered felt suddenly unbearable. Dinner was torture dressed up as civility. They sat across from each other because her mother had arranged it that way, probably on purpose, knowing her mother's tendency toward matchmaking disguised as coincidence. The conversation flowed around them, talk of neighborhood news, renovations, upcoming holidays, and they both participated with the careful politeness of diplomats navigating hostile territory. But underneath the pleasant surface, Seok-ryu could feel the tension building like pressure in a sealed container, all the unspoken things accumulating until the air felt too thick to breathe. Every time their eyes met accidentally, she felt exposed, as if he could see straight through her practiced smiles to the chaos underneath. And maybe he could. Maybe that was the problem with people who'd known you before you learned to hide. They remembered what your face looked like when you still told the truth. It was during dessert that everything finally broke open. Someone asked Seung-hyo about his architecture firm, and he started talking about a project he was working on, his face lighting up with genuine passion as he described a community center he was designing for underprivileged youth. Seok-ryu found herself listening despite her best intentions, drawn in by the enthusiasm in his voice, by the realization that he'd become exactly what he'd always dreamed of becoming. He'd stayed in this neighborhood not because he was stuck, but because he'd chosen it, had built something meaningful here, while she'd been running away thinking that distance equaled success. The contrast felt like an indictment of every choice she'd made, every year she'd spent trying to prove she was more than the girl who'd grown up in this small place. And then, as if sensing her thoughts, Seung-hyo turned to her and asked the question she'd been dreading. "What about you, Seok-ryu? What are you working on these days?" The table went quiet. Everyone was looking at her now, waiting for her answer, expecting her to share some impressive accomplishment that would match the narrative of success she'd spent 10 years building. But the truth was so far from that narrative that she couldn't speak it out loud, couldn't admit in front of all these people who'd watched her grow up that she'd quit her high-pressure job after a breakdown she was still too ashamed to name, that she'd come home not as a triumphant return, but as a retreat, a surrender to the fact that the life she'd built had turned out to be unsustainable. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, and she could feel her mother's concerned gaze on her face, could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down like a physical thing. "I'm taking some time to figure things out," she managed finally, and the words felt like defeat, even though she tried to say them lightly, tried to pretend this was a choice rather than a collapse. Something flickered across Seung-hyo's face, not pity, which would have been unbearable, but something closer to understanding, to recognition. "That takes courage," he said quietly. And there was no trace of condescension in his voice, no hint of triumph that he'd stayed and succeeded while she'd left and struggled. Just a simple statement that somehow made her throat tight with emotion she hadn't known she was holding. The conversation moved on, others filling the awkward gap with new topics, but Seok-ryu couldn't focus anymore. She felt raw, exposed, like a wound that had been covered too long and finally opened to air. When dinner ended and people started saying their goodbyes, she excused herself quickly, mumbling something about needing air, and escaped to the back porch where the night was cool and dark and blessedly empty. She leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. Shame and frustration, and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to grief for the person she'd thought she would become. She heard the door open behind her but didn't turn around. She knew it was him even before he spoke, could feel his presence like a familiar weight in the space beside her. "You don't have to say anything," Seonghyo said softly, coming to stand at the railing but keeping a careful distance between them, respecting the boundary even as he crossed it. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." And that was it. That simple gesture of concern, offered without expectation or judgment, that finally broke through her defenses. "I'm not," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, raw and true and terrifying in their honesty. "I'm not okay. I came back because everything fell apart, because I failed, because the life I built turned out to be a house of cards that collapsed the moment I stopped pretending it was real." The confession hung in the air between them, and she waited for him to say something, to offer empty reassurances or well-meaning advice. But instead, he just nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear, as if her brokenness was something he already understood. And in that moment of silence, with the night sky stretched above them, and years of unspoken history pressing against their carefully constructed walls, Seok-ryu realized that the thing she'd been avoiding wasn't Seonghyo at all. It was the truth of her own unraveling, and the terrifying possibility that the only person who might understand it was standing right next to her. What if the person you spent your entire childhood competing against was actually the one you were meant to find? What if every rivalry, every challenge, every moment you thought you were fighting to prove yourself better than them? What if all of it was just your heart's clumsy way of saying, "See me, know me, don't forget me"? We tell ourselves that love is supposed to arrive like lightning, sudden and unmistakable, burning away all doubt in a single brilliant flash. But what if the truest kind of love is the opposite? What if it's the one that grows so slowly you mistake it for something else entirely? The one that lives right next door to you for years before you're finally brave enough to open the door and let it in. There's a peculiar cruelty in proximity. The closer someone is, the easier it becomes to take them for granted, to assume they'll always be there, to convince yourself that what you feel is annoyance or competition or anything other than the terrifying vulnerability of caring deeply about someone who sees all of you. The brilliant parts and the broken parts, and everything in between. We run from the people who know us best, because being truly known is more frightening than being alone. We build lives in distant cities and call it ambition, when sometimes it's just elaborate avoidance, a way of escaping the uncomfortable truth that home has always been a person, not a place, and that person has been waiting right next door all along. This is a story about Seok-ryu, who spent 10 years running from a neighborhood that felt too small, and a rival who made her feel too much, only to discover that sometimes falling apart is the only way to find your way back to what matters. It's about Seonghyo, who stayed in the place everyone else wanted to leave, who built his dreams in the shadow of hers, who loved patiently and quietly, while she was busy proving herself to a world that would never love her back the way he did. And it's about the 20 steps between their front doors, a distance so small it should have been meaningless, but somehow contained all the years, and all the words, and all the feelings they'd been too scared to name. Because here's what no one tells you about love. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself with fireworks and certainty. Sometimes it whispers in the familiar, in the person who's been there so long you forgot to notice them, in the realization that the life you were chasing was never as real as the one you left behind. Sometimes love is coming home broken and finding someone who doesn't try to fix you, but simply sits beside you in the wreckage and says, "I'm here. I've always been here, and I'm not going anywhere." And sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't leaving or achieving or proving yourself to the world. Sometimes it's just having the strength to stay, to face what you've been running from, and to finally let yourself be loved by someone who's been loving you all along. So if you've ever wondered whether you made the right choice in leaving, if you've ever felt the pull of home and didn't know whether it was nostalgia or something deeper, if you've ever realized too late that the person you took for granted was actually the one who mattered most, this story is for you. This is Love That Lives Next Door. This is about the return that changes everything, the rival who was never really a rival at all, and the 20 steps that contain an entire lifetime of almost love finally becoming real. And so we return to where we began, to the question of what happens when the past refuses to stay behind you, when it takes the form of a person living 20 steps from your front door. Seok-ryu thought coming home was an ending, a retreat, a final admission of defeat after years of trying to outrun the girl she used to be. But what she discovered was something far more profound. That sometimes the only way forward is backward. That sometimes strength looks like surrender. And that the love we spend our lives searching for might have been waiting patiently next door all along, in the one place we were too afraid to look. There's something achingly beautiful about a love that waits. Not the passive waiting of someone hoping you'll notice them, but the active, intentional waiting of someone who knows your worth even when you've forgotten it yourself, who builds a life solid enough to welcome you back when you're ready, who leaves space in their plans for a future that includes your uncertainty and your becoming, and all the messy ways you're still figuring out who you're meant to be. Sung-hyo didn't wait for a perfect version of Seok-ryu to return. He waited for the real one. The one who came back broken and afraid and unsure of everything except that she couldn't keep running. And in that waiting, in that patient, unwavering presence, he showed her what love actually looks like when it's stripped of all the romance novel fantasy and reduced to its essential truth. I see you, all of you, and I choose you anyway. But this story isn't just about romantic love, though that's certainly part of it. It's about the love we owe ourselves, the radical act of coming home to who we actually are instead of who we thought we should become. Seok-ryu spent a decade building a life that looked impressive from the outside while slowly dying on the inside, measuring her worth by productivity and achievement and all the external markers that society tells us matter. It took falling apart completely for her to understand that success means nothing if you've lost yourself in the pursuit of it, that ambition divorced from authenticity is just another form of self-abandonment. Coming home wasn't giving up. It was finally having the courage to stop performing and start living, to trade the exhausting work of being impressive for the vulnerable work of being real. And what about you? What version of yourself have you been running from? What person or place have you convinced yourself you've outgrown, when the truth is, you're just afraid of what facing them might reveal about who you really are underneath all the carefully constructed defenses? We all have our Seung-hyos, people who know us so completely that being around them feels dangerous, who remember the versions of ourselves we've tried to leave behind, who refuse to let us hide behind our achievements or our failures or whatever armor we've chosen to wear. And we all have our 20 steps, those small, manageable distances that somehow feel impossible to cross, because crossing them would mean admitting we need something, would mean being vulnerable, would mean risking the comfort of our loneliness for the uncertainty of connection. The truth that Seok-ryu learned, the truth that maybe we all need to learn, is this: the past only haunts you when you pretend it doesn't exist. The people you're running from only have power over you when you refuse to face them. And home, real home, the kind that heals and holds and helps you become, isn't about geography at all. It's about finding the courage to be seen in all your imperfection, to let someone love you not despite your brokenness, but including it, to stop performing and start belonging. It's about understanding that you don't have to have everything figured out, don't have to be perfect or impressive, or even particularly put together. You just have to be honest. You just have to be brave enough to stop running. You just have to open the door when love knocks, even when that love has been living next door all along. So here's what I want you to take with you as this story ends. Wherever you are right now, whatever you're running from or running toward, whatever carefully constructed life you're maintaining, or whatever ruins you're sitting in after everything fell apart, you're not alone. Everyone has an emotional neighbor, someone or something from their past that still lives in some corner of their heart, still calls to them in quiet moments, still represents unfinished business or unspoken feelings, or roads not taken. And maybe, just maybe, the thing you're most afraid to face is actually the thing that will finally set you free. Maybe going back isn't defeat. Maybe staying isn't settling. Maybe the love you've been searching for has been waiting patiently for you to be ready to receive it. Maybe home was never behind you at all. Maybe it's been beside you this whole time, 20 steps away, waiting for you to finally cross the distance and open the door. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you left behind, or someone you wish you'd been braver with, or some version of yourself you've been trying to find your way back to, know that it's never too late. It's never too late to go home, to face what you've been avoiding, to tell someone how you really feel, to rebuild from the ruins, and discover that what falls apart often does so to make room for something more real, more true, more aligned with who you actually are instead of who you thought you should be. And if you're sitting in your own kind of brokenness right now, wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, remember Seok Ryu standing in her childhood bedroom that first night back, terrified and uncertain, but finally in the right place to begin healing. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's showing up anyway. It's trying again. It's letting yourself be seen. It's loving someone who's been loving you all along, and finally believing you deserve it. Thank you for letting this story into your heart. If it moved you, if it made you feel something real, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because here at Ctrl plus Love, we believe that stories aren't just entertainment. They're medicine, they're mirrors, they're gentle reminders that you're not alone in whatever you're feeling. Every story we share is an invitation to remember that love still exists, that hope still matters, that coming home to yourself is the bravest journey you'll ever take. And maybe, just maybe, your own love story is waiting for you too. Not in some distant future or faraway place, but right here, right now, in the people and places you've known all along, but were too afraid to truly see. So go ahead. Open that door. Cross those 20 steps. Let yourself be found by the love that's been waiting next door. Your story, the real one, the one that matters. It's just beginning.